Good morning, Vietnam. Here I am back again. And today we're going to do the final episode. Turns out to be 5 now, not 4, because the last 2 were too long, so I've split it up into 2. Today's the final one, of course, and it will be on Dr. GALLO and his rebuttal of the article I covered in the last video by CELIA Farber, a renowned journalist since '87, when she wrote and has been writing extensively on her research on HIV and AIDS, and basically has found no proof, and in fact a lot of damning evidence that it doesn't exist and how it's killing people, especially in the video I did yesterday on her article in 2006 about the the tests and experiments that were done on Ugandan pregnant women. And GALLO took it upon himself, I would say within 2 weeks, maximum 3 weeks after that was published, to try and break down and rebut everything that she wrote about in that article. It's amazing how he put together so much information within 2 to 3 weeks, and I will cover that in the opening statement when I start going through my notes, and I rebut his rebuttal. And I just want to say I think he is one of the most despicable men, especially medical men, in history. He has absolutely killed so many people. He's not even a very honest guy anyway. He had to get President Reagan involved in around 1986-87 to convince the French Prime Minister at the time that he should share the discovery of HIV with Dr. Montagnier. And I believe he had really not much to do with it anyway. But he wanted to make money, become famous. And then in Miss Farber's article, the biggest part of it is the cover-up, the disgusting cover-up of the bad testing and research that was done and the drugs administered to pregnant women. So they could cover up that even HIV keeps, that still exists, and also to make many, many people, especially conglomerates, pharmaceutical companies, very, very rich. So I will put my notes on the screen and we'll go to it from there. So here we are now going through my notes, which I have cut and paste, of course, from Dr. GALLO'S rebuttal, and my comments on how I rebut his rebuttal. Firstly, as I said in the last part 4A, when I reviewed CELIA Farber's article in HAPER'S magazine back in 2006, of course, Mahatma Gandhi's quote, "An error can never become true, however many times you repeat it. The truth can never be wrong, even if no one ever hears about it." It is so true about AIDS and HIV and the disgusting human beings and governments who have perpetuated this lie to us. God knows how many people they've killed, especially the damage they've done to pregnant women and their babies all over the world, but especially in Africa and in Uganda, as exposed by CELIA Farber's article. At the end of this video, I also had the first 4 articles by Dr. GALLO and his cohorts on HIV. He co-published, actually, and then follows an article on hepatitis B and then on herpes. I have highlighted some words and sentences on all of them. I will not be commenting on any of them, as this video will be too long as it is anyway. But just to show you how the HIV articles are written differently, the words they choose, and the jargon they use to convince you that the articles have great validity and cannot be questioned in any way. These are for you to compare with other recognized scientifically published articles on viruses. And you will see, if you get to the end of this, or just watch the end of it and go through my highlighted words and sentences, how they are different from the two articles, one on hepatitis B and one on herpes. So I went through this in part 4B at least. I can't remember if it's in part 3 as well. Also, a bit of my personal history and a little bit more on the history of HIV, including President Mbeki of South Africa, how he never believed the HIV story, and again mentioning the John le Carré novel and the movie, which is actually set in Nigeria, and how I don't know if he actually did write this and it's really a reference to HIV and AZT. Anyway, I mentioned this earlier in the previous video as well, how propaganda is even given to younger children, and how movies sometimes depict real life, and in this case, The Fugitive. One of the first main statements that Ms. Farber makes is in her reference 1, how being in a different country determines if you have HIV. As I stated in the beginning, in almost all of Africa, no blood tests are carried out to determine if you have HIV, and then it develops into AIDS. And yet, everyone is still claiming, especially this moron Dr. Gallo, that it is the epicenter of HIV infection. I'm including in the next two web pages how disgusting the narrative and the writings have been. The first one only written months before Montagnier, the so-called co-discoverer of HIV, published his findings. But AIDS is already an epidemic according to CDC in especially America. It is totally misanthropic, racial and biased against people with drug habits and haemophilia. The only thing they have in common, of course, is that their immune system is totally compromised. The acronym HIV was not even published yet, but here it is in the description. How? What, did they have a phone call with Montagnier? Most of the references are from CDC, a huge amount of them. Both articles discussed in more detail, actually in part 1 of this series. I'm going to just go through them quickly. One article entitled and published in March '83, Current Trends Prevention of Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome, Report of Interagency Recommendations. And of course these are the 4H Club, which is mentioned again in part 1. The above article has no data of any size to back any of the statements and any of this 4H group up. Here are some quotes from the article. Current epidemiologic evidence identifies several groups in the United States as at increased risk for developing AIDS. I mean, how can they possibly know this? Current epidemiologic evidence identifies several groups in the United States. Most cases have been reported among homosexual men with multiple sexual partners. How do they know they had multiple sexual partners? Abusers of intravenous drugs, and Haitians, of course. Again, you have to go back to part 1 and I explain why they included the Haitians. However, each group contains many persons who probably have little risk of acquiring AIDS. Why this caveat? Recently, 11 cases of unexplained life-threatening opportunistic infections and cellular immune deficiency have been diagnosed in patients with haemophilia. Available data suggests, again, this language they use to try and convince you that they have indisputable evidence of what they're going to say next, that the severe disorder of immune regulation underlying AIDS is caused by a transmissible agent. Again, zero proof. The distribution of AIDS cases parallels that of hepatitis B virus infection, which is transmitted sexually and parenterally. Again, zero goddamn proof. The second article is one of the most dishonest I have read in all my research on this so-called hoax. There is lie after lie after lie. If you take out the acronym HIV, then it is simply recommendations on how to stay healthy, prevent any illnesses, especially STDs. They are still publishing these lies even after all the evidence that possibly HIV does not exist and that HIV antiviral drugs are actually killing you. Everything highlighted in blue, I think, is a lie. And this is published in not even a year ago by the World Health Organization. I'll let you go through it. I'm not going to read it. I'd rather get on to the debunking article by Dr. Gallo. I hope you guys read all this because it's just absolutely disgusting how they're still printing this. So in March 2006, as I said in the last video, it must have been early that Ms. Farber published her article in Harper's magazine, and now I would think within 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks max, they are debunking her article. As I write, he responded, it appears within 2 weeks. Did he get an advanced copy of the article, or was he already prepared to debunk anybody who questioned his hypotheses that AIDS is caused by HIV and he is the great discoverer of HIV? So this is the web page, and I have cut and paste from it. This is the opening section, and it lists 8 people. And as I write, if you look at the authors, other than Gallo, none of them are experts, like Dr. Duisberg in molecular and cell biology, except maybe Dr. Moore, number 7 on the list, professor of microbiology and immunology. I mean, he is nowhere near where at least Dr. Gallo is working. So, and many of these people are not even close to Dr. Gallo. So what did they do? I don't understand how they wrote this article altogether if they're not in the office next door. I assume they believe their combined expertise printed like this would show that they cannot be disputed or wrong in any way. Classic intimidation by so-called experts. So this is how they've broken down their debunking of Ms. Farber's article. I tried to find the original print of the article to make references more clear, but I had found it previously, but I tried to find it again and couldn't find it. So he breaks it up into 4 main categories: misleading, false, fairness, and bias. Now, I've only gone through a handful, I didn't count, between 5 and 10, of what I'm debunking what he is debunking. So, and the 4 main topic keys are testing, related to HIV, testing of ARVs, related to antiretroviral drugs, MTCT, mother-to-child transmission prevention, trials related to clinical trials, and HIV related to HIV as a cause of AIDS. I try to, as I said, try to do more cross-referencing. I managed to do some, but I couldn't do all of them. So, for example, in GALLO 1, which is right here, if you go back, no, actually you can't cross-reference it. Forget that part. So he writes, paragraph 37, column 1. FARBE'S states that pregnancy itself can cause a false positive result. She supplies no supporting reference. Well, actually, she doesn't need to, because here are, and some of these articles are very recent, but there must have been enough evidence at the time and enough false positives that were produced, and especially all the hullabaloo over the Uganda testing in the late 90s and early 2000s before this article was written. That must have given GALLO a lot of concern about whether she's right or he's right about the transmission. So in less than a year ago, they tried to cover up false positives this way. So can pregnancy cause a false positive HIV test? Not exactly, which means yes, but false positives do happen. Experts say pregnant people can experience positive simply because they're tested more often. What has that got to do with anything? They're either positive or they're not positive. What they just said, you don't get false positives, and yet because they're tested more often, which is twice, first trimester and the third trimester, suddenly false positives are common. But again, this is only for HIV, none of the other common viruses. Although uncommon, false positive results do occur less than 2% of the time. I think that's an absolute lie, according to CDC. But depending on the type of the test, so these are more narratives on why you get false positives. But depending on the type of the test, false positives are experienced more often in pregnant people. But just above it says you don't get false positives. Notes Jamie Leipless, OBGYN and founder of Marina OBGYN in Marina del Rey, California, which was just around the corner where I lived for 25 years. Well, how often? False positives are experienced more often in pregnant women. Well, then how often? It must be much more than 2% if this OBGYN is writing about it. And another expert, at the same time, the screening test used for HIV is not always precise, says Felix Gersh, another GYN, founder of the Integrative Medical Group of Irvine and the author of Fertility Fast Track. The screening test used measures antibodies. There is a possibility that other substances in the person's body will react and result in false positive tests. When the screening test of a pregnant person returns a positive result, a different type of test called the Western blot is run as a confirmatory test. But now I research Western blot. It has been totally debunked for testing HIV. And I lay it out here. And presence of HLA-DR antibodies in those who've been pregnant before. In other words, good antibodies in your system, viruses that are there, and trying to kill all the bad viruses in your system. So you can be fighting off an infection, or you can get a flu vaccine and it'll give you a false positive. And these are the other things. screening for syphilis, increased antibodies in your blood, as I just said, which may be caused by an infection, autoimmune hepatitis. What a joke. These circumstances are for any medical test. What happens if you get negative, positive from any HIV so-called test? But nowhere in any of the literature I have read over the last 2 months has there been any discussion when you get negative, positive, whatever. The only time it came up was when in part 2, I think it was part 2, that Christine Major tested positive, negative so many times, and that's when she realized it was just a complete hoax and wrote her mini book pamphlet on all the different tests around the world. So if you get a positive test, you don't know whether it's positive, a false positive or not, in fact, then they recommend another test. But as I said, what if that's positive too? Can you get 2 false positive tests, especially if you're pregnant? Yes, of course you can. But they state has a very small chance of giving a false positive. But it's a complete lie, as these 2 previous experts, GYN doctors, have said. Farber alleges that HAPER'S, that is a woman who she starts her article with in part 4a, was carried out incorrectly. And that is that she was only given 1 test and there was no follow-up test to test 100% whether she was HIV positive. But she was never exposed to, in any way, to, even if you believe that HIV exists. So Gallo tries to brush this off with, if this was the case, medical negligence is a different matter to whether HIV tests carried out according to protocol are accurate in pregnant women. Farber didn't say that. She said they did 1 test only, and she claims it was a false positive. She doesn't claim there was medical negligence is they didn't follow up and they didn't track her to find out whether she was really exposed to anyone that was HIV positive. And he claims that they were highly accurate. But it's a complete lie also. And it become more accurate over time. Another complete lie. HIV tests are amongst the most accurate available in medicine, medical science. He's just a lying son of a bitch. Referred to in my previous parts to Dr. Lanka, Dr. Mullis, Dr. Duisberg, and Dr. Richards in part 2 and 3, and Dr. Mullis and Dr. Richards, who developed the PCR test and who developed the ELISA test, emphatically say you cannot use these tests to test for HIV. This reference to here, 1984. This is 1 year after the first article on AIDS, and at about the same time that Gallo produced his first 4 publications, which are at the end of this article, as I mentioned. And this is the abstract. What it's called, Epidemiological Studies of Human T Lymphotropic Retrovirus, type 3, in Acquired Immunity Deficiency Syndrome, in other words, HIV. Gallo refers to this article in a double-blind study, 34 patients. You can't do double-blind studies with 34 patients. It's just not enough. You need around 1,000 patients, that's to start with. 19 patients with lymphadenopathy syndrome and 14 homosexual men with an increased risk of AIDS. How do they know they had an increased risk of AIDS? More shit jargon to convince you somehow that this study has some validity. Were screened for antibodies to proteins of the novel What, someone wrote a novel? Yeah, that's what it is. It's just a novel of human T lymphotropic retrovirus, a leukemia virus. Now remember, viruses cannot cause cancer. Why is there an increased risk of AIDS by the 19 homosexual men? The patients had leukemia already, 34 patients. What's the control group? So he claims that they were recently isolated from AIDS patients. God forbid they really had some sort of other disease, on a combination of a convenient and rapid enzyme-linked immunosorbent assay, whatever the shit that means, a blood test, and a more sensitive Western assay. Well, later, is it later? I talk about the Western blot test that's been totally debunked and is not used, in fact, anymore for HIV. Sorry, where was I? 100% of the AIDS sera were scored positive. The Western blot test has been totally debunked, as I just said, for use for HIV testing. So it says 100% of the AIDS sera were scored positive. So that means I don't know whether he's referring to the 19 or the total 34. So I say, how many patients? 3 or 5 from the initial study, less than a year ago. Oh, I'm writing there was, on the initial study that was done by Montagnier, there was either between from my reading between the lines, there was between 1 to 5 patients that they did and concluded that there must be a virus like HIV that is causing the immunity deficiency, severe immunity deficiency in those patients. He goes on. Similarly, 84% of the lymphadenopathy patients were found to have serum antibodies to HIV. Yes, but why does it have to be HIV? Why cannot just be that they were really sick and they have an immunity deficiency? A lower but significant portion, 21%, of healthy homosexual men, that means when they tested them, they did not have HIV, but have an increased risk of AIDS, were also positive. Well, how can that be if they were healthy homosexual men? So the HIV wasn't present at the time they... So I don't get it. Very confusing. And again, I write that, and many scientists, including Dr. Duisberg, has stated that the gay community use heavy drugs, and that's why their immunity system is so shot, especially nitrates. So where is the controls? The control group. So he goes on. No, including those with heterophile antibodies during the course of infectious mononucleus, which is glandular fever, and patients with T-cell or B-cell lymphoma had antibodies to HIV. Okay. So I don't know. These guys are already so sick. So, of course, they're going to have antibodies trying to kill all the bad viruses in their body. They're immunity deficient, they are dying. But he goes on. Significant risk of the disease, and suggests that HIV is the primary cause of human AIDS. What? 33 patients, no control group. They're already sick as hell. But, oh, God forbid that this HTLV3 is the cause why they're dying. And I write, what a bad study and conclusion. Only 34 patients to reach a conclusion that is so significant. And if I just, for the mathematics, 19 plus 14 is 33, not 34. So, here's reference 3 on HIV testing 101 in November 23, 2001. So this was before these two articles. So initially when I looked for the companies making the test, it was Murex Diagnostics, actually from the Philippines. And they were linked to Lumi Quick Diagnostics, a US manufacturer. But now I find out there was only one company making the test, and now more recently, a couple of weeks ago, I researched again and came up with 4 companies in an article, the 4 best HIV at-home tests. February 1st this year in Healthline, which goes, self-testing for HIV is remarkably reliable. Unbelievable when the makers of these tests have said you cannot use these tests for HIV. So anyway, here it is here. And of course the crap, you can have HIV positive, you can be HIV positive for 10 years or longer without symptoms. The only virus that can kill you stays dormant for 10 years or longer, can be dormant for 10 years or longer. So this article goes on that there's so many manufacturers, but in fact only those 4 above have been licensed by the FDA. And these tests use artificial HIV proteins. So one of the spokespersons, which just happens to have my name, can be detected using other reagents that are usually coupled to an indicator, such as a dye or enzyme that can produce color. The change in color is read by a machine. Wow! Such scientific jargon and knowledge. And I write, what a hopelessly non-provable, no-basis statement. What does artificial HIV proteins, when does it do that? All within this tiny little plastic capsule. As I write, this is the only time I've seen this statement. Which proteins activate the so-called HIV virus? So, as I said, I didn't read the whole article. You can read it yourself and see how you feel about that. GALLO'S reference number 4. It turns out, and this was in 2000, so it's only 23, 24 years ago, but the web page doesn't exist anymore. Another rebuttal by GALLO. GALLO on page 20 of Ms. Farber's article, and GALLO 3 on page 13. GALLO describes Farber describes what our phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 means. How you describe different tests and research and what type of and size of groups you need to do phase 1, phase 2 or phase 3 trials. I write, Farber describes the AZT study that resulted in FDA approval as a phase 2 study. Sorry, this is what GALLO writes. As a phase 2 study, but that was actually presented as a double-blind placebo-controlled study. So here is the study here. So reference you see 54. And here it is here. The efficacy of azithromycin, AZT, in the treatment of patients with AIDS and AIDS-related complex, a double-blind placebo-controlled trial. And here's the abstract. So here's the lie right at the beginning of the abstract. And they have 282 patients. You need close to 1,000, or at least a minimum of 1,000 patients to do a phase 3 study. So already there's not enough patients. 282 is not a phase 3. At best, I don't even know if it's big enough for phase 2. Anyway, so it goes on. Sorry. How efficient is AZT with these patients? So there's two types of patients, one with pneumonia and one with advanced AIDS-related complex. So that means they have another disease, but not pneumonia. In other words, they're dying of something else like hepatitis. As I've mentioned in the previous videos, there are many things that you can be, that can give you an immunity deficiency, and then when you so-called test for AIDS or HIV, it comes up positive. But in fact, you are immunity deficient because of all these other related diseases that can give you, as it says here, were stratified according to numbers of T cells with CD4 surface markers. So they were given, different groups were given different amounts of AZT. Now here, not all the patients finished the 24 weeks. 19 placebo recipients and 1 AZT recipient died during the study. I guess P is some sort of probability. And it goes on, opportunistic infections, which I've discussed in detail in part 2 of this series, developed in 45 subjects receiving placebo, as compared to 24 receiving AZT. So that is their biggest piece of information they get out of this. In other words, they're saying there's a 50% less chance that you will develop HIV or opportunistic infections if you take AZT. So this is what they keep publishing and saying the reason why AZT was so effective. So after 12 weeks, the number of CD4 cells declined to pre-treatment values among AZT recipients with AIDS, but not among AZ recipients with AIDS-related complex. So the AIDS-related complex subjects didn't test for, when they were tested, they were tested but didn't have so-called AIDS. Okay, as Montagnier has stated, you must have an opportunistic infection with HIV to develop severe complications and maybe die. If they are already sick, then they have some disease already. Why did some patients not complete the full testing schedule anyway? Again, what does that even mean? In other words, a great contradiction. CD4 cells decline, and then you died. Another thing that came up here was, in this test, was skin test energy was partially reversed. So I assume they had some sort of skin disease, maybe skin cancer of some sort, in 29% of subjects receiving AZT, as compared to 9% of those receiving placebos. These data demonstrate the AZT administration can decrease mortality. Again, it's a tiny sample, and the frequency of opportunistic infections in a selected group of subjects with AIDS or AIDS-related complex, at least over the 8 to 24-week study. But skin test energy was partially reversed. Yeah, but when you read other articles, any time after you take AZT, it does decrease your mortality and does control your CD4 counts and allows them to actually increase. But what happens after a certain period of time, that can be one day, it can be actually quite a long period, apparently from their studies up to 10 years. But then AZT kills almost anything in your body, and your CD4 cells count drop again, and then you die. So it can be effective, but in the end it still kills you anyway. And what about the quality of life when you're taking AZT? How come there's not... I haven't read anything about that. What is your quality of life when you're on AZT? I know, as we all know, if you've ever had anyone close to you die of cancer, and I know 2 people, I mean, the drugs they give you are killing you anyway, and you become a skeleton until you actually die. So as I said, there's no way they can reach any definitive conclusion. So see my notes on the drug AZT, especially in part 3. So as I write, I couldn't find this false HIV in FARBE'S article because I couldn't cross-reference it accurately. So column 2, sorry, at the end of column 2, at the end of column 3, to postulate with other causes of AIDS, and makes various statements about the demographics of AIDS. No sources are cited for her pondering. This is particularly poorly researched and fact-checked part of this article. Not a single credible peer-reviewed article published in a credible scientific journal since 1990 offers any support for what she says here. Instead of a complete point-by-point explanation, some critical comments are offered. So, this is my research on debunking GALLO'S debunking. All the way from this page, 13 to 17, I give many articles that debunk GALLO, stating that there are other reasons which causes AIDS. Then what were people, why is it then, there were so many of those diseases I mentioned in the previous videos, people were dying of, but they weren't dying of HIV, or on their death certificate that wasn't saying caused by complications caused by AIDS. They were just dying of these diseases. Why can't he admit to that? Anyway, there are many articles actually in the webpage I've listed here on Wikipedia on denialism, and it's a very long webpage, and I've cut and pasted many, as you see from here, references and articles, and you can cross-reference these. The first one by Duisberg, he references number 27. I don't know if I do below, but I'll also another physiologist, Bernstein. His first peer-reviewed article detailing his objections to the mainstream view of AIDS and HIV. So, well before this article by Dr. Gallo, 1991. These 12 scientists and doctors and activists, but they tried to get it published, but of course it was rejected in 1993. There was an article claiming, with the reference number 30, you can go back and look it up, that saying that Duisberg is a crackpot, and he's one of the preeminent doctors in cancer, and he's a microbiologist. I mean, it's just disgusting that they, as this article says, had forfeited his right of reply by engaging in disingenuous rhetorical techniques. If you read anything Duisberg has said, he has only said, let's do proper checking, testing, research, and see if AIDS, HIV rather, is what Montagnier and Gallo claim it to be. And this is, in Australia, there was a group that I have referenced more than once, that the Western blot test for HIV was not standardized, non-reproducible, and of unknown specificity due to a claimed lack of a gold standard. References 31 and 32. You can check for yourself. So, and in 94, because remember, this is a Wikipedia on denialism, so you can read this yourself. And even here it says that Duisberg claims HIV undoubtedly exists, but it is harmless. And it's just part of the many, many viruses we have in our body that is trying to help us survive when we become really, really sick and our immunity is shot. As I have argued, and here, I am not sure whether it exists or not, but anyway, Stephen Lanka, which I refer to him extensively, claims it does not exist. This was back in 95. And of course, the National Institute of Health, the Department of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, released a report concluding that abundant epidemiologic, virologic, and immunologic data support that the conclusion that infection with HIV is the underlying cause of AIDS. Absolutely disgusting. So let's go back to reference 35, which was the 7 steps that claim to have drawn by the Pasteur Institute. So this is the reference. And the article, again, quotes Peter Duisberg. He believes that HIV does exist, it's a particular virus, but it's harmless. And here's the article, reference again by Dr. Lanka in 95, and he claims it does not exist because to infect another cell, HIV must at some stage in its life cycle exist as a separate and identifiable entity. And you can read that article. It's been there. Here it is again. But I have referred to this article many times in this 5-part series. And when I wrote this, I wrote that there was only one company. And what's interesting here is this is from Dr. Lanka. Its results require interpretation, and the criteria for this interpretation vary not only from laboratory to laboratory, but also from month to month, because the tests are programmed to detect a certain viral load and certain proteins that your body produces, and they're not all the same. And we go back to the he references also the Perth, Australia, 1993, where they claim in going back to the origins of HIV virology and telling the HIV story, a view will be presented which will make clear that HIV itself, the very object of this Manhattan Project of modern medicine, AIDS research, does not exist. Reference 37, the relationship between the HIV and AIDS in July 24th, 1995. And this article claims the extraordinary death rates among HIV-infected individuals confirm that the virus is an important cause of premature mortality in Africa. There is absolutely no proof of this statement. At the time, HIV and death from AIDS was attributed only if you had, we're talking about Africa, 5 health issues. No blood tests were performed, and even today, almost, if any, are done still. No blood tests were performed in non-Western countries until well in the night. I wrote this, actually this part quite a while ago, if ever in most African countries. People have received blood transfusions for decades. However, as discussed above, AIDS-like symptoms were extraordinarily rare before the appearance of HIV. So, I mean, there's so many contradictions in this HIV story. Leading to severe immunosuppression and constitutional disease, neurological complications and opportunistic infections and neoplasms that rarely occur in persons with intact immune function. I don't know. But can you get all these symptoms before HIV was discovered? Yes, that is the whole point. I've been arguing from the beginning. People were dying of hepatitis, pneumonia especially, and if you're a heavy drug user, your immune system is so shot, and especially in the gay community because of the nitrates they were taking. Here's another sentence that has absolutely no backing because of the words they use. Although the precise mechanisms leading to the destruction of the immune system have not been fully delineated, abundant epidemiological, virological, and immunological data support the conclusion, which this is the same sentence from above, is the underlying cause of AIDS. Not that you're a heavy drug user. Not that you've acquired hepatitis B. And what about in today with COVID-19? And I mentioned this here, reference 38. This article has about 300 references, almost. I didn't even look at it because most of the references are government agencies, especially CDC, is quoted 19 times. Dr. Gallo research articles 4 times, the WHO 4 times. Luckily, also Dr. Duisberg is cited 7 times. But if you want to read the article, here it is. Community-acquired pneumonia in HIV-infected individuals. Not that you can't acquire pneumonia if you don't have HIV. So, anyway, if you want to read it, it's just absolute lies lying through their teeth. Risk factors for, I'm going to read a bit. Risk factors for pneumonia include low CD4 count. Well, that happened before HIV was discovered. Unsuppressed plasma HIV load. Yeah, that's just because it's HIV now. They've called the cells in your body that are trying to save your life. Smoking, injection drug use, and renal impairment, which we all had before HIV was discovered. So you can get pneumonia from the community, but the risk factors have nothing to do with HIV. We had them before and we still have them today. You can get low CD4 counts with any of the other diseases without being HIV positive. So, what is the difference? It's the conclusion from that article. Risky sexual behavior and needle sharing. And later, otherwise, preventable cases of HIV infection and AIDS may occur. If this were true, as the headlines of the main news outlets were espousing back in the mid-80s and late 80s, then millions more would have died. But they didn't. In fact, in the US, it's been so-called reported that HIV patients has been constant for the last at least 30 years at around 1 million. Continuing for Dr. Gallo. So to continue again, this is about 3/4 of the way through of Dr. Gallo's rebuttal. HIV does not affect the heterosexual population in the US. Sorry. HIV does affect the heterosexual population in the US, not just gay men. Well, again, reference 80 we'll look at in a second. But it goes on to say poverty, where untreated sexually transmitted infections, lack of prevention knowledge, lack of power of women to negotiate condom use, increased frequency of transactional sex are more likely than in wealthier populations. Unprotected anal sex due to greater risk of abrasions and blood transfusions. Wow, what a statement. What a lot of garbage. All the above is just speculation with no proof, zero proof. And it's such a put down on people of low socioeconomic means. Yes, apparently from the data, if you believe the HIV hype, of course, more African American women are becoming HIV positive. But again, you have to believe it even exists. And from my experience, now this is personal, about anal sex, again, it's only me talking, it is not that common in heterosexual relationships anyway. In almost, well, at least again for me, a white Caucasian middle to upper class person. If it were true, then by the HIV doctrine, then many more would have HIV. But how does this cause a transmission? And the only way by their literature is that if you have a tear and then blood somehow from the so-called HIV positive person enters the blood of your partner. And I write, this only proves one main hypothesis, that it is much more a gay person's disease, if you believe again the HIV, because of the high drug use. Also, rich people have stopped having sex. What a stupid statement. So it goes on from blood transfusions to people with intravenous needle reuse and exposure to multiple partners. God, you talk about fear-mongering. All increased risk of HIV transmission. And explains the demographic aspects of the disease with which Farber fumbles. Yeah, well, your response fumbles like garbage down a chute. Also, these are the same reasons as mentioned in the beginning of this video from an article from just last year by the World Health Organization. 20 years later, nothing has changed from the pro-AIDS HIV scientists and agencies. They're just regurgitating and rewriting, and they just keep giving us all these lies. These are good reasons for increase, but some are a little far-fetched. But what about more simple explanations, like diet, stress from eating bad food, no accommodation, tap water, recreational drugs, cost of living, no future? I mean, the stress, all these, and the drugs that people have taken and do take can, of course, give you an immune deficiency. 2. In contrast to Farber's implication that proposed causes of AIDS rather than HIV have not been tested, they have in great depth. And as we've shown, almost all the studies are very small. And the conclusions are just ridiculous considering the size of the studies. These studies have found that in the absence of HIV, none of recreational drug use, poverty, malnutrition, and homosexuality can predict the onset of AIDS. Then, why has there only been so-called a constant 1 million people in the US for the last 35 years? As I write, also again, Africa does not have all of these issues, problems, and it is the epicenter of HIV infections. You give no proof today. All these references have been removed. See below for this reference. This rebuttal does not exist anymore. So there was a slightly larger study, 715 homosexual men. And now a new word has been added, 350 seronegative men. Despite the fact that these men reported appreciable use of inhalable nitrates, poppers, and other recreational drugs, and frequent receptive anal intercourse. So I guess their immunity was compromised. Excuse me. So here's the article here from The Lancet. We describe findings in such a cohort, 715 men. Unbelievable how small always these test groups are. Most men negative for HIV-1 antibody reported risk behaviours, but none developed any AIDS illnesses. Were they taking the drugs? Nitrates, other poppers, downers, uppers? CD4 counts fell in the HIV positive men, but remained stable in antibody negative men. The hypothesis that AIDS in homosexual men is caused not by HIV-1 infection, but by drugs and sexual activity is rejected by these data. It's 715 men. HIV-1 has an integral role in the pathogenesis of AIDS. What about all the ones that died? What's the follow-up? Where's the blood test? Where's the control group? Men with non-homosexual men, or homosexual men with. It says most men negative for HIV-1. How many? No AIDS-defining illnesses occurred among 350 seronegative. So half of them were seronegative. Yeah, well, but that also proves that HIV doesn't exist. So here's the article, HIV-1 and the Etiology of AIDS. March 1993, and it costs $55.20 to purchase, which I refuse to, of course, because I have researched and read so many of these articles. As I write here, where is the proof from a study of only 715 men? So 50% did not develop HIV, even though the control group was identical. Why not? What's the explanation? There's no answer. They never answer any of these questions. Because no one does the research and follow-up and separation and comparison to answer this anomaly. And I write here, the same thing is happening to transgender treatment. A major clinic shut down because the patient's emotional needs were pushed aside. And the follow-up was absolutely disgusting. Zero follow-up to find out what happened to any of these young children, teenagers also, after they were given these transgender drugs. You can read the whole article. I have read some of it, and I watched the reporter who actually broke the news about what was going on in this clinic, actually on the Trigonometry YouTube channel. Dr. Hilary Cass, who is leading the independent review of the clinic, found that patients' other mental health issues were overshadowed if they mentioned gender to clinicians at Tavistock. Tavistock is the name of the clinic. In other words, they just gave them the drugs because a 10-year-old boy walks in and says, I'm a girl, so give me drugs. And zero follow-up. From Dr. Gallo again. He even writes this. Montagnier said this in 1983. The sustained loss of CD4 plus T cells is extremely rare in the absence of other immunosuppressive conditions. You must have, if your immune system is so shot, there's got to be another underlying cause why it's happening. And it's happening because you have something like hepatitis, today COVID-19, but one of the biggest ones is pneumonia. So they're claiming here in some study 22,000 determined tests, 2,713 HIV seronegative homosexual men revealed only one individual with CD4 plus T cell persistently lower than 300 cells. And this individual was receiving immunosuppressive therapy. But how does that prove anything? As I write, they are not sick yet. What more information do you need? So the one guy on AZT, the drugs were killing his CD. That means the drugs were killing his CD4 cells. In another test, in a survey of 229 HIV seronegative injection drug users, they've introduced a new word. It just means they've tested negative. Only 2 individuals had 2 CD4 plus T cell measurements of less than 300. One of them who died with a cardiac disease, and the other from non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, listed as the cause of death. Non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, cancer. I don't know what that proves. Okay, continuing. Study in July 6, 93. Reference 81. Again. Reference 81 is the same as reference number 25. These articles are no longer available. But again, only 229 test subjects. How can you reach any conclusion with 229 test subjects? So even it finally writes here, the use of some recreational drugs, such as methamphetamines, can place individuals at greater risk of requiring HIV infection. What about just destroying their immune system? And this does not mean the drugs cause AIDS. That's correct. They don't have AIDS. They're dying of immunity deficiency without HIV. FARBE'S claim that researchers have failed to demonstrate a higher incidence of AIDS in people with HIV is false. Where? You wrote this article in 2006. Why are these articles not accessible anymore? Is there something wrong with the studies and research, or are they easily discredited like almost all the articles I have looked at so far? Here is further tiny sample of such studies. It demonstrated that participants with HIV were approximately 1,100 times more likely than people without HIV to get a disease associated with AIDS. Okay. 80. Well, as I mentioned above, this study is not available anymore. 81. Can't find this page anymore. I don't know what. 82. 80, 81, 82. Study's not available anymore. This study is not available anymore. The evidence that HIV causes AIDS. So there's 3 major articles he cited that are not available on the internet anymore. He goes on, Farber provides no reference for her claim that HIV is a harmless passenger virus. The claim is false and disproven by the evidence presented in this document. Well, he hasn't proved anything in this document so far. 5. Farber provides no references for her claim that HIV is primarily spread from mother to child. The claim is false. Most HIV transmission is through heterosexual sex. A quote from Farber, all babies born to an HIV-positive mother are born positive, but most become negative within 18 months. Not primarily, I write. Farber's research has continually stated that, if anything, HIV is mainly transmitted within the homosexual community. My spelling is totally off. No proof from you also, from GALLO also. I have felt that it's mainly, as I write here, mainly HIV, well, the immunity deficiency is mainly very high amongst gay men because of their overuse of drugs for enhanced sexual pleasure. Immunity deficiency only leads to other diseases. And I personally knew 2 gay men who were passed away who were heavy drug users. So if you do that HIV test, as Farber says, and as I said pages ago, that the mother can easily be HIV positive. So therefore, the same conditions occur in the baby. They are positive when they're born, but within 18 months, they become negative. So many gay men get Kaposi's sarcoma, a certain cancer that is associated with high immunity deficiency, especially if you take nitrate inhalers. GALLO writes, she gives no evidence, assuming she is right. If a sizable minority are not, then nitrate inhalers cannot be the cause of Kaposi's sarcoma. So there's a huge article on Kaposi's sarcoma. If you take out any reference to HIV/AIDS, it makes no difference to the article. It just means that high drug use, you can end up with Kaposi's sarcoma, which is basically a skin cancer. Miss Farber's footnote 14, and I've cut and pasted it in here. There is ample statistical and epidemiological evidence linking the rise of mass drug abuse in the late 60s and 70s with the sudden appearance of AIDS. The overwhelming majority of AIDS patients with Kaposi's sarcoma, for example, have been heavy users of nitrate inhalers or poppers. The case of super AIDS that was recently reported in New York turned out, upon closer examination, to be an individual with an extraordinary heavy methamphetamine habit. I write, GALLO makes a mistake of connecting the wrong dots. She's stating that a majority of nitrate inhalers have gotten KS, which has nothing to do with HIV. Not everyone who has sex gets venereal or a communicative disease. In fact, the majority don't. So going back where he says, assuming she's right, if a sizable minority are not, then nitrate inhalers cannot be the cause of Kaposi's sarcoma. Not everyone gets Kaposi's sarcoma if they take nitrate inhalers. It depends on your immunity system. So this is still from Miss Farber's article. I'll let you read it. Actually, it's too important. nor have controlled studies been carried out. And that's the key word, controlled studies. And that's what Duisberg has said again and again and again. And 2,000 to 3,000 reputable scientists have said the same thing. To prove that hemophiliacs infected with HIV die sooner than those who are not infected. There's been hemophiliacs around for thousands of years. Such studies might be expensive and tedious, but expense has never been a serious objection to AIDS researchers who have spent many billions of dollars in the last 20 years on HIV research and practically nothing on alternative causes or even cofactors. As I said earlier, even Luc Montagnier has stated repeatedly that the virus cannot cause AIDS without a contributing cause. In other words, you have to be immunity. This is where the contradiction is. You must have be immunity deficient. Anyway, no one is saying that no proof of that. Remember, you die of some immunity deficiency anyway, but then how did well-off people get HIV? As he references it above, with the wealthier populations. And then there's some reference to the Holocaust denialism. As I write, safer sex has been stressed for decades, but people still get herpes. If you listen to the hype in late 1980s to mid-1990s, millions of people should have died of HIV. So why have not millions gotten herpes? There are millions that have herpes, but they haven't died because the virus, and it's the same with hepatitis B and even COVID-19. People have taken precautions and they don't get so sick, or they have developed a drug to counteract the viruses. COVID-19, they have, herpes they haven't, and they treat hepatitis B extremely well today. Remember, there is no drug or any real treatment to prevent HIV. So he goes on 51.1 about other diseases, and I write, but these treatments we know have saved millions of lives. HIV still has no proof of how many lives have been saved anyway, or how many have actually been killed prematurely from AZT and the other retroviral drugs. Misleading HIV. Again, he claims she's highly selective. These treatments have had a substantial effect on improved life expectancy. Well, that is true, but like cancer, you live longer, but it eventually kills you anyway. So now there's quite a few, at the end of his article, he attacks many people that's mentioned by Farber, and he attacks them personally. So he's claiming that this guy, who used to be a expert on retroviral viruses, stopped being one and decided to treat people who are sick with so-called AIDS in Africa with natural methods, but he attacks him personally. And I write, well, what about all the deaths in Uganda from the HIV and the nevirapine trials? Of course, Gaylor never mentions anything like that. So reference 1 and 93 cannot be accessed, cannot be accessed, cannot be accessed. Farber describes the death of one patient and implied this is relevant to the science of HIV. Well, he might recall that one person's death is not enough to even consider what's really going on with the drug AZT and the other retrovirus drugs, because they claim it's saved millions of people. Well, it was relevant to her because she's the one that died. And because of the lies and the lack of morals and ethics within that community at that time, not explaining to her that testing positive after one test, you must have a minimum of another test. And of course, she was never exposed to anyone that was so-called HIV positive anyway. So he's just as big a schmuck as he ever will be and always will be. So this is a reference to the antiviral drugs, heart, determinants of survival following HIV seroconversion after the introduction of heart. So, in other words, when you get any of these antiviral drugs to help you survive longer, remember, there is no cure for HIV, no drug for HIV. So, here's another nice article in 2003, where the word seroconversion came into play, as I mentioned, you can see here. So, let's have a quick look at it. I'm going to go a little bit faster now, and you can read all you want about seroconversion. Seroconversion is the development of special antibodies in the blood serum as a result of infection or immunization, including vaccination. So, which is it? Seroconversion is a result of an infection. Then you say may or may not be, so it may or may not be detectable. How do you tell the difference if you, as in the beginning of this article we talked about transmission of HIV from mother to baby, how you can easily be HIV positive. So you may not, let's go on, explains it better here. The general stages of seroconversion for hepatitis B, where the lines of detectability indicates seropositivity. So, during an infection or when you have been immunized, antigens enter the blood and your immune system begins to produce antibodies in response. Before seroconversion, that it means going from, for HIV, negative testing to positive testing. So they're making this bold statement. Before seroconversion, and we'll see soon the time frame for so-called HIV to develop in your system and when it's first detected. The antigen itself may or may not be detectable, but the antibody is absent. Well, so in HIV, well, we'll see the graph in a minute. It's just unbelievable. All this in highlighted in red is just mumbo jumbo. So they're trying to cover it up because they can't prove dog shit. Seroconversion refers to the production of specific antibodies against specific antigens, meaning that a single infection could cause multiple ways of seroconversion against different antigens. Well, they never talk about it like this for, you'll see in a minute, for hepatitis B or for COVID-19. Why are they talking like this only about HIV? Seroconversion rates are one of the methods used for determining the efficiency of a vaccine. But remember, and this is critical again, why these articles are just such lies. There's no vaccine, so seroconversion rates are meaningless when it becomes to HIV because you're not given a vaccine for it. goes on to say the higher the rate of seroconversion, the more protective the vaccine for a greater proportion of the population. But there is no vaccine. So we finally now refer to COVID-19 because it's a real virus and they have real vaccines for it. And here it goes, try mumbo jumbo by standard techniques. Seropositivity status depends on the sensitivity and specificity of the assay. Well, there's no language whatsoever on COVID-19 like that. False positives, false negatives, crap, and more crap. So here's, which article was this? Oh, the seroconversion in Wikipedia. So it goes on to talk about HIV, and then I say, what parameters are you talking about? Only this language for HIV reporting, as you'll see in the next two parts of this seroconversion in Wikipedia. So the average window period for the development of antibodies to the P24 antigen, the standard for testing is about 2 weeks. However, the window periods used for the assays, blood tests, are based on capturing as many people as possible. And I say, what? Parameters of the test? What is many people? What are they referring to? Reference 26, the timeline for HIV infection. You can see here, I've made it too small. You're going to have to look at the original article if you want to see it. But this is the graph they developed for HIV, and the bottom here is years. So they're claiming that you only die in this period, but actually you can die anywhere on this red graph. I should have made it large, but it was so long I shrunk them too much. So anyway, so let's read on. The timeline for an IV, I think HIV infection, where seroconversion occurs during the acute HIV syndrome. So they're saying for the first few weeks, you can't detect the antigens anyway. COVID-19. Seroconversion testing is primarily used to detect individuals who have been infected with COVID-19 in the past, who have already resolved their infections. But this is in a matter of days. I remember when I got it, I felt really off for a few days, and I tested myself and I was positive. But you're talking here weeks. In fact, somewhere in there, it's like 50 days. Anything before 50 days, it was in the Part 4A, anywhere before 50 days, the chances of you detecting HIV are nearly zero. However, seroconversion may be helpful for individuals with suspected infections. So then what is the point? Only to do with HIV. This article is basically to compare seroconversion and try and make it sound like HIV is equivalent to COVID-19 and hepatitis B. And as I write here, this appears the case with all viruses except HIV. So you can see seroconversion plays a major role in the diagnosis and treatment of hepatitis B infections. And as I say, they're giving all this, and you can see the different graph they've submitted, and they've given many weeks at the bottom here, but the testing and what they test is nothing like. This is your hemoglobin and your antigens in your bloodstream, all these things, PCR positive, right? But if you look at the graph here, on the left and right, this is the proteins, your RNA, and the other side is your CD4 count. Why don't you do comparison directly? Because you cannot. So, another article. HIV seroconversion, what it means, symptoms and timing. What symptoms, how to treat and prevent HIV infections after seroconversion. I don't even know what that means really in the end. They use the word prevent but if it's seroconversion, they're gone from negative to positive. So if they're positive, what are you preventing? So I'm finalizing this. This is the end actually of back here on the how many things I've tried to debunk on GALLO, and then I go into these to show you how more of, because now finally the word seroconversion was mentioned, so I'm bringing that up to show you how they're trying to sell you another bag of goods with seroconversion and comparing it to hepatitis B and COVID-19. And now I'm finally finishing the second last thing I'm going to say, and articles on just simply a virus. And it does mention here, viruses can't reproduce without a host. Some common diseases caused by viruses include the flu, the common cold, and COVID-19. But notice there's nothing about HIV or AIDS. And here's the overview. Another article, viruses are small germs that can infect you and make you sick. They can infect humans, plants, fungi, etc., etc. Each one infects only specific types of hosts. Viral infections in humans can cause no symptoms or make you extremely ill, and everything in between, of course. Types of illnesses they can cause: respiratory illnesses, which is the main death caused by so-called HIV, pneumonia, diarrhea, vomiting, sexually transmitted infections, and skin conditions, which they may be referring to Kaposi sarcoma. Again, nothing in there about, as I write here, as time passes, this will be the more common typical article written about viruses with no mention of AIDS or HIV. As I write again, I only debunk some of Dr. GALLO'S debunking of CELIA FARBER'S statements, and I think very easily, no need to debunk any more of his lies, bullshit, and crap. At the end, as I mentioned earlier, he personally attacks about 6 of the denialists, and none of them have ever attacked him personally. And as I write, the one who makes personal attacks is normally the one who's usually wrong. So here are the 4 articles I mentioned right at the beginning. So you can see the wording, the logic, the sentences, the inferences, and the language used, which is so different when they were talking about the research on AIDS. And so these are the first 4 articles that were co-written by Dr. GALLO back in May of 84. This is the first one: detection, isolation, and continuous production of cytopathic retroviruses, in other words HIV, from patients with AIDS and pre-AIDS. So this is in Science magazine, and I'm not going to read them. It's up to you if you want to stop the video and take a look at my keywords. The second article, May 4th, printed at the same time. Wow, he was a really busy guy in May in 1984. Frequent detection and isolation of cytopathic retroviruses from patients with AIDS and at risk of AIDS. So here's the abstract. I hope you get to this point and you can see my keywords and how you'll see in a minute. The third one, they're all, I didn't even notice, they're all May 1984. He was very, very busy. Serological analysis of a subgroup of human T lymphotropic retroviruses, HIV, associated with AIDS. And here's the abstract with the keywords I've noted in different colours. And of course, just to read, HTLV3 is thus a true member of the HTLV family. Okay, here's my keywords. And the final article, all on May the 4th. Antibodies reactive with human T lymphotropic retroviruses in the serum of patients with AIDS. Now, this one, I haven't been able to find too many words and sentences that I think are only appropriate, appears to HIV research, but there is some, of course, in my keywords. The major immune reactivity appears to be directed against P41, the presumed envelope antigen of the virus. Presumed. So, here are two articles. The one on herpes, sorry. The first one's on herpes, and it was in 2014. So it's actually 30 years later. But what's critical is when the articles by Dr. Gallo were published, was the beginning of the lies and the development of drugs that actually, and the approval of all stem from these, mostly from the original 4 articles. And this is by the National Institute of Health, and you will see, if you read them, how different the language, the words that is used. I'll only read the last sentence. These results provide a new framework for understanding human herpes simplex virus evolution and demonstrate the importance of using selection-informed models of sequence evolution when investigating viral origin hypotheses. They're saying a lot more work has to be done. So these are the keywords from the article, and here are my keywords. And now here's an article on hepatitis B in 2013. This one was 2014. This one is on hepatitis B. Medical virology of hepatitis B, how it began and where we are now. And this gives a brief history of hepatitis B, that 620,000 people die per year. But there are 240 million chronic HBV carriers. But I guess the governments and the other large pharmaceutical companies, for some reason, don't want to find a cure. And like they found for COVID-19. But you can please read this, and you will see the language and the sentencing is so different, in my opinion, completely different, the way it's written compared to the HIV articles. Among the problems that still remain today are the inability to achieve a complete cure of chronic HIV infections. You can apply that sentence to HIV 100%. So, that's it. Hope you enjoyed this series. Extremely long. It's at least around 7 hours. Almost nobody has watched it so far. If you ever get to this point, It means you were really interested in finding out the truth about AIDS and HIV and how it's a complete hoax and how it's killed who knows how many people, especially pregnant women and their babies, and especially so many people not knowing what they were doing when they signed up for the trials, especially in Uganda back in the late 90s. Thanks again. See you in my next video.